In 1998, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in South America. It had the world's largest proven oil reserves. GDP per capita was higher than in Brazil, Chile, or Argentina. The government ran budget surpluses. Poverty was declining. Foreign investment was flowing in. By 2019, Venezuela had become the poorest country in South America. Over 7 million people, roughly 20% of the population, had fled the country. Inflation reached 10 million%. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. Grocery stores were empty. People were eating from garbage bins. A teacher's monthly salary couldn't buy a single chicken. This collapse happened in just 20 years, not because of war, natural disaster, or external invasion. Venezuela destroyed itself through economic policy, specifically through socialist economic policy that ignored basic principles of how economies and human psychology actually work. This is the money timeline. Today, we're going to examine why socialist regimes consistently fail. We'll look at the recurring patterns, the economic mechanisms that break down, and the psychological realities that socialist systems ignore. We'll focus heavily on Venezuela, the most recent and dramatic example. We'll examine the Soviet Union, the longest-lasting socialist experiment, and we'll discuss China, the outlier that survived by abandoning core socialist principles. At the core of every failed socialist regime is the same fundamental issue. The system destroys incentives. In market economies, there's a direct link between effort, risk, and reward. If you work harder, innovate, or take smart risks, you personally benefit. If you slack off or make bad decisions, you personally suffer the consequences. This creates a powerful incentive structure that drives productivity and innovation. Socialist systems break this link. When property is collectively owned and rewards are distributed by the state rather than earned through performance, the connection between individual effort and personal outcome weakens or disappears entirely. Consider a farmer under collective agriculture. If he works harder and produces more, the extra output is distributed across the collective. His personal benefit is minimal. But if he slacks off, the loss is also distributed. His personal cost is minimal. The rational response is to do the minimum required to avoid punishment. Over time, everyone makes this same calculation. Production declines. This isn't theoretical. This is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union under collectivization. Productivity collapsed. Farms that had fed millions created famines, not because the land became less fertile, but because the farmers lost the incentive to maximize production. The same pattern appears in factories. When workers receive the same wages regardless of output quality or quantity, quality declines and productivity stagnates. When managers are appointed by political loyalty rather than competence, and when their pay is divorced from company performance, efficiency suffers. Socialist systems often try to solve this with quotas and monitoring, but monitoring is expensive and imperfect. People find ways around quotas. They meet targets by sacrificing quality or gaming the metrics. Soviet factories famously produced heavy chandeliers not because there was demand for them, but because factory output was measured by weight. The incentive problem extends to innovation. In market economies, innovation is driven by profit potential. If you develop a better product or more efficient process, you capture the gains. In socialist systems, the gains from innovation are socialized, while the effort and risk remain individual. The result is technological stagnation. The Soviet Union could copy Western technology, but consistently failed to innovate. Cuba operates vintage 1950s cars not because they're charming, but because domestic innovation stopped. Human beings respond to incentives. Systems that ignore this reality consistently underperform and eventually collapse. Even if the incentive problem could be solved, socialist systems face a deeper structural challenge. They cannot efficiently allocate resources because they cannot process information. In market economies, prices act as information signals. When demand for a product rises, its price increases. This signals to producers to make more. When supply exceeds demand, prices fall, signaling to reduce production. This happens continuously across millions of products without any central coordination. Prices compress vast amounts of information about scarcity, demand, preferences, and production costs into a single number that everyone can understand and act on. Socialist systems attempt to replace this with central planning. Bureaucrats in government offices decide what should be produced in what quantities, at what prices, and using which resources. This is an information processing problem of staggering complexity. To efficiently allocate resources, planners would need to know the preferences of millions of consumers, the production capabilities of thousands of factories, the availability of countless inputs, and how all of this changes over time. No human or committee can process this much information. Even modern computers struggle with optimization problems of this scale. The result is chronic miscalculation. Planners produce too much of what people don't want and too little of what they need. Surpluses and shortages exist simultaneously. Resources are wasted on low-priority goods while high-priority needs go unmet. The Soviet Union experienced this constantly. Stores would have warehouses full of identical shoes in sizes nobody wore, while basic sizes were unavailable for months. Factories would produce tractors while spare parts were impossible to find. Food would rot in warehouses while cities experienced shortages. The information problem also means socialist economies cannot adapt quickly. In markets, when conditions change, prices adjust immediately and resources shift. In planned economies, changes must work through layers of bureaucracy. By the time planners recognize a problem and adjust, conditions have changed again. This inflexibility is fatal in modern economies, where technology, preferences, and competitive conditions evolve rapidly. Socialist economies get locked into outdated patterns of production. They fall further behind as adaptive market economies race ahead. Venezuela provides a clear example. When oil prices were high, the government used oil revenues to subsidize everything. When oil prices collapsed in 2014, the government couldn't adjust. Rather than allow prices to rise and encourage domestic production, they maintained price controls. This destroyed incentives for farmers and manufacturers. Shelves emptied. Rather than admit failure, the government printed money and blamed foreign conspiracies. Inflation exploded. The economy spiraled. The information problem is unsolvable under socialism. No amount of planning, computers, or good intentions can substitute for the distributed knowledge processing that happens through prices in market economies. Socialist ideology rests on an optimistic view of human nature. It assumes people will work hard for collective benefit even when personal incentives are weak. It assumes cooperation will emerge naturally. It assumes people will act selflessly when necessary. This works in small groups. Families cooperate. Close-knit communities help each other. People make sacrifices for those they know and care about. But large-scale societies of millions cannot function on altruism. They require systems that align individual self-interest with collective benefit. Socialist regimes consistently overestimate people's willingness to work for abstract collective goals and underestimate the power of self-interest. The result is predictable. When the link between effort and reward is severed, motivation declines. People do the minimum necessary to avoid punishment. They hoard information to protect themselves. They divert resources when possible. This isn't because people under socialism are morally inferior. It's because they're human. When systems don't align incentives properly, people adapt in ways that benefit themselves. In market systems, this adaptation drives productivity. In socialist systems, it undermines the entire structure. Corruption becomes endemic not because socialist countries have uniquely dishonest people, but because the system creates incentives for corruption. When official channels don't work, people create unofficial ones. When prices are controlled below market levels, black markets emerge. When goods are scarce, people hoard and trade illegally. When state jobs pay poorly, officials demand bribes. In Venezuela, as price controls created shortages, a massive black market emerged. Food, medicine, and basic goods were smuggled across borders or sold at enormous markups. Government officials at ports and borders extracted bribes to allow shipments through. The underground economy became larger than the official one. The psychology problem also manifests in political behavior. Socialist systems concentrate power in the hands of planners and officials. This attracts people who seek power and creates opportunities for abuse. Those who control distribution can reward supporters and punish opponents. Political loyalty becomes more important than competence. Incompetent but politically reliable individuals rise to positions of authority. Talented but politically suspect individuals are sidelined. Over time, the system becomes a tool for political control rather than economic efficiency. Leaders double down on failed policies because admitting failure threatens their legitimacy. Dissent is suppressed, not just for political reasons, but because acknowledging problems would expose the system's flaws. The Soviet Union demonstrated this clearly. Acknowledging agricultural failures would have meant admitting that collectivization was a mistake. Instead, failures were blamed on saboteurs, foreign agents, and kulaks. Millions starved while officials maintained the fiction that the system was working. Socialist systems assume people will behave as ideology says they should, but people behave according to the incentives they face. Systems that ignore this reality break down. Socialist regimes require extraordinary centralization of power to function. Someone must control property, set prices, allocate resources, and enforce compliance. This concentration of power creates two critical problems. First, it attracts individuals who seek power for its own sake. People who want to help society through voluntary cooperation don't need massive state machinery. People who want to control others do. Socialist revolutions often attract idealists initially, but as the system demands ever more coercion to maintain control, the idealists are pushed aside by those willing to use force. Second, concentration of power enables abuse with few checks. In market economies, power is distributed across many actors. Politicians, businesses, media, and civil society provide mutual oversight. In socialist systems, the state controls the economy, which means it controls jobs, housing, food, and media. This makes opposition extremely difficult. When economic and political power are united in the same hands, the consequences are severe. Leaders become insulated from the results of their decisions. They don't face market feedback. They don't face electoral accountability if opposition is suppressed. They don't face public criticism if media is controlled. Bad decisions compound without correction. This power concentration also means leaders cannot admit mistakes. In a market economy, failed businesses close and successful ones expand. Failure is acknowledged and dealt with. In socialist systems, admitting that a policy failed means admitting that the planners were wrong, which threatens the legitimacy of the entire system. Instead, failures are denied, concealed, or blamed on external enemies. The Soviet leadership spent decades denying that living standards were lower than in the West, that consumer goods were inferior, that technology was lagging. Admitting these realities would have required admitting that central planning didn't work. Instead, they maintained the fiction until the system collapsed. Venezuela followed the same pattern. As economic policies destroyed the economy, the government blamed the United States, opposition parties, and business owners for sabotage. They arrested critics, seized private businesses, and imposed ever more controls. Each intervention made things worse. Rather than change course, they doubled down. Power without accountability produces catastrophic decision-making. Venezuela deserves detailed examination because it's the most recent and clearest example of socialist failure and because it had every advantage. Vast oil reserves, educated population, functional democratic institutions, no war, no blockade, no external shock. Venezuela destroyed itself through policy choices. The transformation began in 1999 when Hugo Chavez came to power. Initially, high oil prices masked the damage. Oil revenue funded social programs, subsidies, and expansion of state control. Chavez nationalized telecommunications, electricity, steel, cement, and significant portions of agriculture and retail. The government imposed price controls on basic goods, arguing this would ensure affordability. Economic theory predicts what happened next. When prices are set below production costs, suppliers stop producing. Farmers found it unprofitable to grow food. Manufacturers found it unprofitable to make goods. Production declined. Shortages appeared. Rather than allow prices to rise and encourage production, the government responded with more controls. They seized farms and factories, claiming owners were sabotaging production. State-run enterprises replaced private ones. But state enterprises operated even less efficiently because they faced no market discipline. Production declined further. By 2010, shortages were common. By 2015, they were severe. Supermarkets had empty shelves. People queued for hours for basic items. The government rationed purchases, limiting how much of specific goods each person could buy. As production collapsed, the government printed money to finance spending. Inflation began rising. At first, single digits, then double, then triple. By 2018, inflation exceeded 1 million%. By 2019, it reached 10 million%. Money became worthless. Prices rose by the hour. People's savings evaporated. The government imposed capital controls, making it difficult to access foreign currency. This created a massive black market for dollars. The official exchange rate said $1 equaled 10 bolívares. The black market rate reached $1 for millions of bolívars. Anyone with government connections could buy dollars at official rates and sell them at black market rates, making fortunes overnight. Corruption became the most profitable economic activity. Healthcare collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicine, equipment, and even basic supplies like soap. Preventable diseases returned. Maternal mortality soared. Life expectancy declined. Education deteriorated. Teacher salaries became worthless. Schools closed. Qualified professionals left the country. Food became scarce. Venezuelans lost an average of 24 pounds in 2017 due to inadequate nutrition. Children showed signs of malnutrition. People ate from trash bins. Crime exploded. As formal economy opportunities disappeared, many turned to theft and violence. Murder rates reached among the highest in the world. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country between 2015 and 2023. That's roughly 1/5 of the population. This is one of the largest migration crises in modern history, comparable to Syria. But Syria had a civil war. Venezuela had socialist economic policy. The collapse reached a new phase on January 3, 2026. In a dramatic nighttime military operation, U.S. forces entered Venezuela and captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, from their home in Caracas. They were flown to New York to face criminal charges of narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. President Trump explicitly stated the United States would now run Venezuela and tap its vast oil reserves, saying the U.S. would fix the country's oil infrastructure and sell large amounts of oil to other nations. This unprecedented intervention represents the final stage of Venezuela's socialist experiment. A country that once controlled the world's largest oil reserves had so thoroughly destroyed its economy and institutions that foreign military intervention became possible. The government that had nationalized the oil industry, implemented price controls, and centrally planned the economy no longer controlled anything. The socialist policies that were supposed to liberate Venezuela from foreign influence instead made direct foreign control feasible. The tragedy is that none of this was unpredictable. Every policy that Venezuela implemented had been tried elsewhere and failed. Price controls create shortages. Nationalization reduces efficiency. Printing money causes inflation. But ideology overrode evidence. The government believed this time would be different. It wasn't. Venezuela demonstrates that natural resource wealth cannot save a country from bad economic policy. Having the world's largest oil reserves couldn't prevent collapse. In fact, oil may have made things worse by funding bad policies longer and creating a false sense of security. The Soviet Union represents the longest and most comprehensive socialist experiment. It lasted 74 years, controlled a massive territory, and had significant achievements in certain areas like space exploration and heavy industry. Yet it ultimately failed and collapsed. The Soviet economy achieved rapid industrialization in the 1930s through forced collectivization and brutal coercion. Millions were killed or died in famines, but industrial capacity grew. This early success convinced many that central planning could work. However, success in heavy industry masked fundamental problems. The Soviet economy could build steel mills and tanks, but couldn't produce consumer goods people wanted. Stores had few products. What was available was often poor quality. Innovation stagnated. Technology lagged. By the 1970s, Soviet growth rates were declining. The economy was falling behind the West in productivity, technology, and living standards. The gap widened every year. The information problem became increasingly obvious. Planning worked reasonably well for simple, large-scale industrial production. It failed completely for complex modern economies with diverse consumer preferences and rapid technological change. The incentive problem destroyed productivity. Soviet workers had a saying, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." With no link between effort and reward, motivation collapsed. Quality was poor. Innovation was minimal. Corruption was endemic. With chronic shortages, access to goods depended on connections and bribes. A parallel economy operated through personal networks and black markets. Everyone understood the official system was a fiction. By the 1980s, it was clear the system was failing. Mikhail Gorbachev attempted reforms with glasnost and perestroika, hoping to preserve socialism while introducing some market elements. But the system could not be reformed. It could only be maintained through coercion or abandoned entirely. When coercion was reduced, the system collapsed. The Soviet collapse was not caused by military defeat, natural disaster, or external pressure. The economy simply stopped functioning. Shelves emptied, supply chains broke, the state lost control. The system that had seemed permanent for decades disintegrated in months. The lesson of the Soviet Union is that longevity doesn't equal success. The system lasted 7 decades, but it progressively declined. It survived through coercion and by isolating its population from alternatives. Once people could compare living standards and once coercion loosened, support evaporated. China often appears as a counterexample to the claim that socialist regimes fail. The Chinese Communist Party has ruled since 1949 and has presided over extraordinary economic growth. But China succeeded precisely because it abandoned core socialist economic principles. After Mao's death in 1976, China's economy was in crisis. The Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution had destroyed productivity and killed millions. China was desperately poor. Communist ideology had clearly failed. Deng Xiaoping implemented radical reforms beginning in 1978. The reforms were explicitly market-oriented. Farmers were allowed to keep surpluses and sell them at market prices. Private businesses were permitted. Foreign investment was welcomed. Special economic zones operated under capitalist principles. These reforms worked. Growth exploded. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. China became a manufacturing powerhouse, but this success came through embracing markets, property rights, and incentives, not through socialism. Modern China is not a socialist economy. It has private property, it has markets, it has billionaires. The Communist Party maintains political control, and the state owns significant enterprises, but the economy operates largely on capitalist principles. China demonstrates that what works is not the political label, but the economic structure. When China operated as a true socialist economy under Mao, it failed catastrophically. When it adopted market mechanisms, it succeeded dramatically. The Chinese model is sometimes called socialism with Chinese characteristics, but this is more political rhetoric than economic reality. The characteristics that made China successful, markets, property rights, incentives, are the opposite of socialism. China's example actually reinforces the pattern. Socialist economic principles failed in China just as they failed everywhere else. China avoided total collapse by abandoning those principles while maintaining the political structure of Communist Party rule. Socialist regimes fail for consistent reasons. They destroy incentives by severing the link between effort and reward. They cannot solve the information problem that markets solve through prices. They ignore human psychology by assuming altruism at scales where it doesn't exist. They concentrate power in ways that enable abuse and prevent correction. Venezuela's recent collapse shows this pattern clearly. Every advantage, oil wealth, education, democratic tradition, couldn't prevent disaster once socialist policies were implemented. The Soviet Union's long stagnation and eventual collapse demonstrated that longevity through coercion doesn't equal success. China's dramatic success came only after abandoning socialist economic principles. History is not ambiguous on this question. Socialist regimes consistently fail not because of accidents, bad luck, or external enemies, but because of internal contradictions that are predictable and have been demonstrated repeatedly. The lesson is not that social safety nets are harmful or that markets are perfect. The lesson is that economic systems must align with how humans actually behave and how information actually flows. Ideology that ignores these realities produces predictable disasters no matter how well intentioned. Thanks for watching The Money Timeline.